Hello?
Hello?
Hi, Sylvia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, brilliant.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Perfect.
All right.
So I'm not sure, did you have time to check out the channel at all or anything like that?
I did not. I am working on finishing up a new book, and I've just been concentrating on that for the last several weeks.
No, totally understandable.
Yeah.
Well, basically what we do is I interview and make documentaries about all things strange and unusual. So far, I mean, I've spoken with ghost hunters and psychics, but I think you'll probably be the first. Would you call yourself a historian?
I am definitely a historian. I call myself a paranormal reporter. I collect stories of experiences that people have had and kind of try to dovetail that with the history. I really believe that you can't understand the ghost stories of a place without knowing the history behind it, because that's why we have the ghost stories, is because of these things, these events that people have lived through in history.
What drew you to Peoria State Hospital?
Well,
Can you tell us a little bit where we're sitting right now?
We are sitting in one of the buildings of the Peoria State Hospital. There were 63 buildings on the hilltop at the asylum's height. There are only 12 of those buildings left. And this is one of them. This used to be a place called Lohman Hall. It was the activities center for the asylum. That unfortunately burned in 1964. This building was built in 1965. It was the gymnasium for the asylum, place to get a little exercise.
Right.
So this was a very good place to put an asylum, actually. The land for the asylum was donated by the wife of the mayor of Bartonville, and she tapped a fellow named Dr. George Zeller to be the superintendent of this asylum that they were going to build. They all wanted a place of refuge, of safety. The mayor's wife had gone around to the asylums and the poorhouses of the state of Illinois and seen the wretched conditions that people were living in. So she said, you know what, let's build a place where people can come to actually get help instead of just be warehoused. Asylum design at that point in time was usually one of two ways. There was a Kirkbride system, which was one big building that they added on wings. And there was the cottage system. And this is the system that Dr. Zeller wanted to have, the cottage system, because in the cottage system, you have people with the same ailment living together. So you have alcoholics living together. You have people with epilepsy living together.
So you mentioned poorhouses. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on exactly what a poorhouse was?
Poorhouses were a place kind of to warehouse people that were down on their luck. The fact is that poor people have mental illness too. And in the middle of the 19th century, people didn't think that the mentally ill could feel heat or cold or pain or hunger. If you had $25 for a license and an empty barn in your backyard, you could open up your own almshouse and the state would let you do it and you could get funding for it. Sometimes the people were treated no better than animals. We got a lot of patients from poorhouses, from almshouses. At the time it was set up, you had private asylums where you could stay as long as you needed to, if you could pay. And they had state hospitals where you could go for a very nominal fee, But if you didn't get better within 2 years, you were kicked out. You were released as incurable. So there was not really any place at that time for people who desperately needed care but could not afford a private asylum. This was that place. The Peoria State Hospital was that place. Dr. Zeller set it up so that if you needed help, you could stay as long as you needed to. We had the highest rate of reintegration into society of anybody in the state of Illinois, and I believe in the United States. We were really good at curing people. But there were some people that came to us that were just too badly broken, too badly damaged, and they found a home here. There were patients that lived here for decades. They were accepted here, and then they lived out the rest of their natural life. Some of them lived to be 80 or so years old. And this was their home, which leads me to explain why this hilltop is so extravagantly haunted. It's because the spirits, this is their happy place.
Right.
To put it simply, this is a place where they found acceptance, where they found love, where they found care. So yeah, why wouldn't they stay?
Sure. So kind of like in the normal paranormal hauntings, like you usually think of places like where in an insane asylum, it's horrible things, bad treatment, etc. And that's why it's haunted, because it's so traumatic. But here, it's the opposite of that spectrum, where you think it was so positive, they want to stay.
Exactly. Yeah, you go to a prison, you're going to find nothing but bad. You go to an insane asylum, you're going to find nothing but bad. You just say haunted mental asylum, and your mind goes all American Horror Story on you. And you assume that there was pain and fear and abuse because it's a haunted mental asylum. And it is my privilege and my joy to tell people that was not the case here. This was a place where the patients were treated like family. When Dr. Zeller arrived to take his superintendent post, this asylum was fitted out with all of the equipment of an insane asylum of the early 20th century, which meant that there were Utica cribs, there were handcuffs, there were straitjackets, there were bars on the windows.
What was the treatment then like for somebody to say, I came here with like signs of mental health issues, and then anywhere else would lock me up and throw me in a small room and deal with it? What would my treatment be like? Do you know?
Well, here it would be a much gentler sort of therapy. There was a lot of talk therapy. Later on in the asylum's history, there was a lot of art therapy. We still have photographs of some of the artwork that the patients did. It's really quite astounding. I couldn't make art like this. Dr. Zeller believed in an 8-hour workday for his staff and for his patients. He instituted an 8-hour workday, and any patient who was physically able to was given a job to do. And that was very beneficial for them to do. It gave them a reason to get up in the morning. It gave them a sense of purpose. It gave them something to fill the hours of the day. Also, after that 8-hour workday was done, Dr. Zeller made sure that there was enough things to do at the end of the day. All of the cottages, the men's ward cottages, had pool tables, billiards tables, and the women were put to sewing. They were given sewing materials, needles, scissors, in the hands of women that people considered insane. This was revolutionary.
So Dr. Zeller opens this hospital. It's running well. He leaves the hospital. What happens?
Well, he was so well respected that when he retired, he was asked to stay on. The Bowen building, which unfortunately no longer stands, was the nurses' dormitory for a very long time. And as well as the nurses' dormitory, there were apartments in the top floor. And those were used for people who were visiting from out of town. They were put up in the apartments. They were also doctors' apartments. So it was suggested by Mr. Bowen, who was one of the administrators, it was suggested that Dr. Zeller and his wife Sophie take one of those apartments and live on the grounds And his legacy of care and compassion was so strong that it did reverberate for years after his death. This place was still known as a place of compassion and care for many, many years after Dr. Zeller passed.
A heck of a legacy to have. And I suppose then it's a good transition into the closure of what happened. I assume politics and just funding and things of the 70s.
Right. Those two things, yes, were the death knell for the Peoria State Hospital. So the state of Illinois, in its infinite wisdom, started cutting funding. So instead of one nurse for every 2 patients, there was one nurse for every 5 patients, and then one nurse for every dozen patients, and then one nurse for every 60 patients. And that is when, at the very, very end of the asylum's history, that's when unpleasantness started to happen. I don't want to call it abuse, because it wasn't abuse. It was just the fact that we were desperately understaffed. We couldn't keep track of all of the patients. So in 1972, there were 3 deaths at the hospital. 2 of them were patient-on-patient violence. And another was a gentleman who, he was mentally handicapped, not mentally ill, mentally handicapped. And he, for whatever reason, he decided to take a gum wrapper and wad it up and stick it into his ear. And it got infected and it led to meningitis. And that killed him. So with these 3 patient deaths, the state of Illinois sent a commission to investigate all of these deaths. And they found bad conditions here. And they said, we're sorry, but we have to close this place down. And the patients that were left were farmed out to other institutions.
So Sylvia, obviously there's a lot of ghost stories there from this. Obviously it's not as more of an abuse, scary way. It seems like they're more happy to be haunting the grounds. Could you tell us a little bit about any paranormal activity that you may have experienced or people that have worked here?
Oh, there is so much paranormal activity around this entire hilltop. It's just a joy to be here and collect stories of people's experiences. And I have had my own experiences as well. Most of my experiences have happened in the Pollock Hospital. I was with it was several groups together that had banded together to explore the Pollock Hospital for 2 nights running. So that was a bunch of fun. And while we were in the women's ward of the Pollock Hospital, the former tuberculosis ward, we had one of those big electrical spool things with no one within 2 feet of it start rolling towards one of the guys, one of the investigators. That was pretty fun. We did catch a rocking chair rocking by itself. The thing is about everyone thinks about the Bowen building, and really that was the nurses' dormitory and the administration building. There were only 2 deaths that we know of, maybe 3, that happened in that building. So it's not very paranormally active, let's face it. Now, the Pollock Hospital, on the other hand, this is the former tuberculosis ward, being much more haunted than the Bowen building, for example. You've got all of your senses in play. People have seen shadow figures. People have seen full body apparitions. People hear things. I have been in the Pollock Hospital, and I was in the kitchen, and there were 2 other investigators. We were lights out, so we could barely see each other, but I could hear someone whispering and talking in a low voice. You couldn't hear what was going on, but you could hear someone talking, and all 3 of us had our mouths shut. There was somebody singing once, just this little ditty, little tune, just keeping yourself entertained. The sense of taste actually comes into play as well. Tuberculosis causes lesions on the lungs, and when you cough, those lesions rupture and you cough up blood. So there have been investigators and guests in the Pollock Hospital on tours that have tasted blood in their mouths. And sometimes this feeling is so intense that they have to go outside the building and be sick in the grass.
What is the most iconic ghosts here on the grounds?
We have several wonderful spirits here. Rhododary is one of them. Bookbinder is another, and I'll tell his story in the cemetery.
Cool. Well, then let's go ahead and step out and go check out the cemetery and some of the grounds.
Let's do.
Cool. So you want to tell us about where we're standing right now?
Absolutely. We are standing next to cottage B1. This is one of the men's cottages. And there is actually a really good ghost story associated with this, with a cottage very similar to this.
Great.
So if you go that way several hundred yards, there is a building that mirrors this one in its construction. So the way these cottages are set up is that there are dormitories on each side here. In this middle wing here, this E-shaped building, this middle leg of the E is the kitchen. And then the long part of the E is the big room where the men would socialize. So in that building that's several hundred yards away, there was an incident that took place in the early 1960s. There was a patient here named James Sample who came to us from Minonk, Illinois, a couple hours away. And his mania was of a religious nature. He thought that he was the angel of God. He was seriously, seriously disturbed. We don't know exactly what happened, but he did something that got him sent here to the Peoria State Hospital. So one day he was in that other building doing the job that he had been assigned to do, which was helping in the kitchen. And that particular day, the staff of God that he was holding was kind of a crowbar looking thing. It was kind of a flat bar. And there was a dietitian who had been hired just a couple of days before, didn't have good people skills, was completely unfamiliar with James and his mania. She saw him working just one-handed because he was holding the staff of God in his other hand. And he was doing his chores and everything. And she marched up to him, took the crowbar away, put it down, and said, "Use both hands," and then turned to leave. Well, this was the staff of God. You do not touch the staff of God without the angel's permission. So the angel of God took up the staff and he smote her with it.
Good Lord.
Opened her skull. She ran out of the kitchen, made it as far as the beginning of the common room. He chased after her, hit her again. That time she was dead before she hit the floor. So when people talk about the cemeteries on the grounds of the Peoria State Hospital, there are anywhere between 3 and 5. This is Cemetery 1. It's sometimes considered 2 cemeteries because behind me right now we have the section that is reserved for veterans. Dr. Zeller was very conscious of the people that served our country, so he made sure there was a special place set aside for them. What makes Cemetery 1 one of the most special places on the hilltop, in my opinion, is that this is the resting place of a woman named Rhododary. Rhoda had some sort of break with consensual reality. She swore that invisible witches were after her. She would have fits. She would cower under the table in the dairy's small cabin, screaming that there were invisible witches swooping down from the ceiling to attack her. So her parents had her sent to the hospital at Jacksonville. She was a very violent patient. She was locked in her room every night. Rhoda spent 2 years in Jacksonville. Jacksonville was a state hospital, and the rule for state hospitals at that point in time, in the middle of the 19th century, was that you had 2 years to get better or not. If you weren't better in 2 years, you had to give up your place at the hospital to someone who did have a chance to get better. Rhoda was released from Jacksonville as being incurably insane. Her family cared for her at home as long as they could, but in 1860, her mother died. Her father could no longer care for her at home, so he made the heartbreaking decision to have Rhoda committed to the Adams County Almshouse. Now, almshouses in the middle of the 19th century had the potential to be deeply awful places. If you had $25 for a license and an empty barn in your backyard, you could open up your own almshouse, because even the doctors of that time thought that the mentally ill could not feel hunger or cold or heat. So in some cases, they were treated no better than animals. And the staff at the Adams County Almshouse was absolutely unprepared to deal with someone with Rhoda's depth of mental illness. She developed a condition called pica, which is a compulsion to eat inappropriate objects. She would crawl around on the floor, and anything she found on the floor, a pin, a penny, a nail, would go straight into her mouth. If she was given a piece of fried chicken for her lunch, she would cram it into her mouth, bones and all. She would lunge at passersby and try to pick the buttons off their blouse or their shirt and put it in her mouth and swallow it. So for her own protection and for the protection of the other inmates of the almshouse, the superintendent had Rhoda put into something called a Utica crib. Now, the Utica crib was standard issue at mental asylums back in the day. It was developed in Utica, New York, in the asylum there. And it's basically a large baby's crib with one important distinction. It's got a barred top that also locks. But these pieces of furniture were never designed for use longer than overnight. Rhoda was left in her crib for weeks and months at a time. Utica cribs were usually lined with a thin hospital mattress. Rhoda's was lined with straw. Mice would nest in the straw and run over her face. There was a strategically cut hole at about hip level and a tray underneath, like a rabbit cage, and for the exact same reason. She was in the crib for so long that her hips atrophied and her knees drew up to her chest. When she was let out, she was no longer able to stand. She had to crawl around on the floor on her hands and knees. She spent decades in this situation. Now, in 1902, Dr. Zeller became the superintendent of the Peoria State Hospital. And one of his bedrock beliefs was that no one is beyond help. Everyone deserves a chance to gain mental health. So how do you prove that? How do you prove that no one is beyond saving? You go around to the almshouses and the poorhouses of the state of Illinois, and you cherry pick the worst of the worst cases, the cases that no one else wants to have anything to do with. That's exactly what Dr. Zeller did. He brought them here to this hilltop. He went to the Adams County Almshouse, and that's where he found Rhoda. Dr. Zeller took one look at Rhoda and said, "This patient is coming with me." And the superintendent of the almshouse didn't want to let Rhoda go because he figured that the almshouse was going to be blamed for her condition. Go figure. And Dr. Zeller said, either this patient comes with me or I shut your institution down effective immediately. The nurses knew her excruciating history, so they made sure she wanted for nothing for as long as she lived on the hilltop. They waited on her hand and foot. She could no longer see. Sometime in the first 10 years of being at the almshouse, she decided that she no longer wanted to watch the world go by through the bars of a cage, and she clawed her own eyes out. She may have developed gangrene from putting sharp objects in her mouth and lacerating her tongue. She lost the power of speech. So she couldn't see, but the nurses made sure that she experienced the hilltop in any way that was left to her. They spread out blankets in the gardens and let her sit and feel the sun on her face and smell the flowers whose colors she could no longer see. They took her to dances so she could listen to the music. It's said that she never smiled when she came here, except when Dr. Zeller came into the room. Either she recognized his voice or the scent of his cologne, we don't know. But whenever Dr. Zeller walked into a room where Rhoda Derry was, she lit up beaming. She knew that he was her savior. She was with us for a couple of years. In the summer of 1906, she probably developed tuberculosis in the almshouse, but in the summer of 1906, her case became full-blown. So she was taken from the cottage where she had been living to Dining Hall A, which we will also see a little later on. And that is where she passed away in 1906, the day before she would have turned 72 years old. Passed away the day before her birthday. So Rhoda is one of the most beloved spirits on our hilltop. She loved this entire hilltop so much that she can be sensed pretty much anywhere on the grounds, but she has a special affinity for her gravesite. When she was a teenager, she picked up the habit of chewing tobacco. So even when she was at the asylum here, she could no longer stand. She still had to crawl around on the floor. But if she knew that a visitor had chewing tobacco in their pocket, she would kind of crab across the floor and tug on their pants leg. And that was her signal that she wanted a bit of chaw. So if you're anywhere on the hilltop, but especially here in front of her grave, and you smell chewing tobacco and you feel a tugging on your pants leg, that's Rhoda trying to get your attention. That's what I find most fascinating, is that Rhoda knows her own ghost lore. I was here with a couple of ghost hunting groups. There were 3 groups that banded together to do a 2-night investigation of the Pollock Hospital. So they were there Friday night and Saturday night, and I was there both nights. And I told Rhoda's story several times Friday night, and they came over here and offered her some chewing tobacco and just hung out with her for a while, like you do. And there was a psychic medium, a couple psychic mediums in the group. And one of them was just stewing about this story that I had told several times. All day Saturday, as they were at the hotel, as they were having lunch, she just thought, this is so unfair. Here was this woman who suffered so terribly in life. And even in the afterlife, she is still reduced to crawling around on the floor on her hands and knees. And that's how she's spending her afterlife. How is that even fair? So she showed up along with everyone else at the Pollock Hospital. And the Pollock is set up with a long hallway with 2 wings at either end. It's the tuberculosis ward. So she was in this long hallway, pretty close to the entrance. And psychic medium, she became aware that there was someone sitting on the floor of the hallway. And she realized that, of course, sitting on the floor, it must be Rhoda Derry. So she looked down, and Rhoda looked up at her, made eye contact, and slowly got to her knees, and then stood to her tall, beautiful height and went, as if to say, I can stand. I'm whole on the other side. Of course I am. I'm whole and perfect on the other side. I'm not reduced to crawling around on the floor, but she knows her own ghost lore. So she knows that if she shows you the smell of chewing tobacco, and if she tugs on your pants leg, you're gonna know that's her trying to get your attention. So you'll notice that a lot of these tombstones here just have numbers on it, and that bothers some people. It bothered me too until I found out the reason for it. Illinois state law says that you can't have a name on a tombstone unless it's the person's actual legal name. And a lot of the patients here came to us unable to tell us their names, or they just went by nicknames. So every patient was assigned a number. And when they passed away, if they were buried on the hilltop, their number was carved onto their stone. But we are here in Cemetery 2 to talk about this fellow right here. Now, he's an exception. He is known as Bookbinder. He's one of the most famous ghost stories to come out of the Peoria State Hospital. So in 1906 or so, there was a patient that arrived on the hilltop, and he had suffered a nervous breakdown at work. He worked either in Peoria or Chicago, we're not exactly sure where, but he had suffered a nervous breakdown at work, and his breakdown was so total and so complete that he lost the power of speech. He was rendered mute. And all anybody knew about this guy was that he had worked in a bookbindery in one of those big cities. So, lacking any other information about this guy, the intake nurses wrote down in the intake ledger a manual bookbinder. So he became known as Bookbinder, or Old Book for short. So one of Dr. Zeller's genius ideas was to institute an 8-hour workday for everyone, for the staff and for the patients. This was its own little community. The only thing that was not made and produced on the hilltop was shoes. Everything else the patients helped to make. They worked in the kitchens, they worked in the steam tunnels, they worked in the factories that produced heat and light, the power factories for the hilltop. They helped out with their own living situations. So every able-bodied patient was given a job to do. Old Book was put on cemetery detail. And this is a really good thing. I mean, people say, oh, you're making the patients work. Well, it gave them a reason to get up in the morning. It gave them something to fill the hours of their day. Gave them a sense of purpose. So Old Book was put on cemetery detail. His job was to keep the cemeteries nice and tidy for visitors who came to visit their loved ones. So very soon after he got here, there happened to be a death on the hilltop, and there was a funeral held because the person was buried on the hilltop. So Old Book stuck around after he dug the grave, and he stuck around for the funeral service. And he was standing there listening to the service being read, and his shoulders started to hitch a little bit, and a tear tracked down his cheek, and suddenly he was just crying openly, and he didn't want to disturb anyone at the funeral, so he walked over to a great big elm tree that was in the middle of the cemetery here, and he leaned against the trunk of the tree and just howled and moaned like his heart was breaking. And when the service was done, he collected himself and wiped his eyes and came back and filled in the grave. So he did this for every cemetery, for every service he attended on the hilltop. And he attended every service. He became sort of an urban legend around the hilltop. If a patient knew that they were on their deathbed, they would grab a passing nurse and say, hey, make sure Old Book cries for me or I won't get into heaven. Well, in 1910, Bookbinder himself passed away. We're not exactly sure what he died of. He might have had tuberculosis. There was also a pellagra epidemic that was sweeping the hilltop at that point in time, so he might have died of that. At any rate, Old Book was dead. He was a well-loved personality on the hilltop, so his funeral was very well attended. And Dr. Zeller was there. He said a few words, a hymn was sung. The grave was dug, and the coffin was sitting on top of the grave, on top of a couple of 2x4s with ropes slung underneath it. And the idea was that 4 guys lift up on the ropes, other people slide the boards away, and the coffin is gently and respectfully lowered into the grave. Well, they went to do this. The service was over. They were going to lay Old Book to rest. And they grabbed a hold of the 4 ends of the ropes and they lifted up, and the coffin bounced up as though it was empty. And just then, all of a sudden, everyone at the funeral heard a wailing and a moaning coming from the tree in the middle of the cemetery. And they looked over and they saw the ghost of Old Book leaning against the tree, carrying on and howling and crying. People didn't know what to make of it. Nurses fainted, people fell to their knees. No one knew what to do, but Dr. Zeller took charge, and he said, I want that coffin open right now. So someone ran and got a crowbar, and they jimmied up the lid of the coffin and opened the coffin, and as soon as they opened the coffin, the wailing stopped, the ghost vanished, and there in the coffin was the body of Old Book, undeniably dead. And we know about this because Dr. Zeller wrote about it in his memoirs. He said, it was awful, but it was real. I saw it. 100 nurses and 300 spectators saw it. Now, the story of Old Book doesn't end there. After about 6 weeks or so, the old elm started to die. And no one wanted to see Old Book's tree die, so they watered it, they took care of it. But it became obvious over the passing weeks that the old tree was on its way out. So Dr. Zeller's a very safety-conscious guy, so he sent out a crew to chop the tree down. And at the first couple of strokes of the axe, the crew swore they could hear the ghost of Old Book crying from inside the tree trunk, and they threw down their axes and said, no, we can't have any part of this. We can't take Old Book's tree down. So they reported back to Dr. Zeller, like, we can't do that. So Dr. Zeller sent out a fire crew to burn the tree down. So they piled a bunch of kindling around the edges of this old dead elm tree, and they were standing by with buckets of water for safety, and they poured the kerosene on, they struck a match to it, and in the crackling of the flames, they swore they could hear the voice of Old Book still crying, and they could see Old Book's face coming up in the smoke, and they said, oh, no, we can't. So they doused the fire, and the old tree was allowed to die on its own. And legend has it that when the old tree finally fell, it fell right between the rows of gravestones and didn't damage a single stone as it fell. And the carcass of the old tree was rolled into the ravine there and allowed to return to nature. So when ghost hunters were here, when the TAPS crew was here, they investigated the Bowen building, and they took one of their nights here, I think it was Wednesday night, and they set up a camera in front of Bookbinder's grave, and they told the story, and they actually captured an apparition moving. It started off from behind that big black tree that right there. It started off there and walked several feet and then vanished. And they said, oh, that's great. We captured the ghost of Old Book. Isn't that wonderful? Because if we were to walk over there, you would see that the ravine drops off very suddenly. There is no way a human being could be walking there. They captured an apparition. So who was it that the TAPS team captured? Well, about the time Old Book was here, about 1906, there was a fellow that came to us from Hannah City, which is about 20 minutes away or so, by car. I mean, wagon, it would take a little longer than that. So his name was Charles Jones, and he came to us voluntarily. He was a voluntary committal. He was suffering from depression. So he made himself agreeable to everyone. Everyone liked him. The patients on the hilltop were allowed free range to wander anywhere they wanted to go. They weren't restricted. They weren't locked down unless they were violent patients, which Charles was not. So he was allowed to wander anywhere and explore the hilltop. Before there was an asylum here, there was a mining operation, and the miners left some of their equipment. So in his exploration, Mr. Jones found a box full of blasting caps, and he pocketed one of them. So after he'd been with us for several weeks, he decided he no longer wanted to fight the demons of his depression, and he went down into one of these ravines, and he put the blasting cap between his teeth and either bit down on it or socked himself in the jaw and blew his head off, as though it had been decapitated with a guillotine. It was that neat and clean. So the historians of the hilltop are pretty darn sure that since Mr. Jones was using this blasting cap for a very off-label purpose in the ravines, that's whose ghost was captured, by the TAPS team walking along the cemetery, along the edge of Cemetery 2 by the ravines. So one of the ghosts that resides in the Pollock Hospital is a ghost that we like to call Heavy Boots, because his MO is to run on up on somebody in the hallway, making a whole bunch of noise, stompity, stompity, stomp, and just scare the paste out of whoever it is that he's running up on. Never attacks anybody, but can really scare the bejesus out of you if it happens in the dark. So he has been haunting the Pollock Hospital for years. And this is another interesting situation where the history of a place informs the hauntings of a place. In the 1950s, this was being used as a tuberculosis ward, and there were two guys rooming here. Their names were Jesse Bonham and James Spall. And they were roomies, they were young guys, not particularly ill with tuberculosis. So they were just in there for treatment, but they also had mental issues because they were in the hospital for a reason, not just tuberculosis. So one night, for reasons unbeknownst only to him, James came up behind Jesse and whacked him across the head with a broomstick. And Jesse took offense to this. We don't know why James attacked Jesse, but Jesse was not very happy about it at all. So he picked up the closest thing to hand, a floor polisher, and beat James to death with it. James had no idea that Jesse was going to react this way. So he died very quickly and very violently. Perfect recipe for a haunting. Now, this was a working hospital, so it was a going concern 24 hours a day. And Heavy Boots is most often witnessed and experienced late at night. So that's what we think is going on, is we have this ghost who died very, very violently, and he just gets a charge out of being aggressive and running up on somebody and just scaring the paste out of them. So this being a tuberculosis ward, the intake doors were on the other side of this hallway. And when a historical tour went through, the historians would explain the process, the intake process. And sometimes we were even lucky enough to have volunteers that would act out these scenes for the people taking the tours. So that's what was happening one night when I was doing another show just like this one. The historian was talking about the intake process, and we had a volunteer, two volunteers, one cosplaying a young girl with long hair and one cosplaying a nurse. So the historian explained that when patients were admitted to the hospital, they were taken across the hall to a small room, their clothes were taken and burned out back, and a woman would have her long, beautiful hair cut off because tuberculosis germs were carried on the clothes and the hair, so they had to get rid of as much of that as they could. So this volunteer, this actress, comes across the hall, and she's being escorted by the nurse, and she's got long flowing locks, and she's clutching a doll to her chest. They go into the room, the historian explains the process, and then Deanna comes out again, and she's still clutching the doll, but now her hair is just chopped short to her head, and a nurse escorts her to another room across the hall in the different side of the hall. And it was very effective to watch this in real time, what the historian was talking about. So the historian is continuing on with her speech, and from the hallway all of us standing in the hallway can hear 2 deep tubercular breaths. Like that. And Deanna and Jackie are in the room, still playing the patient and the nurse, and Jackie was like, what's going on? And Deanna is the patient. She's like, are they making fun of me? That's so rude, that's horrible. And meanwhile, us in the hallway are thinking, wow, Deanna is just pouring it on in there. Good Lord, what's she doing? It wasn't any of us that were making the noise. It was somebody just wanting us to know what they experienced. So that was really an interesting situation that we just happened upon.
So you want to tell us a little bit about where we're sitting?
Absolutely. So we are sitting on what is left of the Bowen building. It used to stand right over there in that grassy area beside the retaining wall. So the Bowen building was really the public face of the Peoria State Hospital. It was a beautiful limestone building. It was used as the nurses' dormitories and nurses' classrooms for a very long time, several decades. And Dr. Zeller got a lot of flack for putting this building up. People said, oh, why are you making this gorgeous building just to teach a couple of nurses? Beginning of the 20th century, they didn't really have a lot of respect for women. But Dr. Zeller was very invested in teaching women and empowering them. A lot of his staff was female. He would go around to the high schools in the area in Peoria, and he would give lectures, and he would go to young women's classrooms, and he would say, if you want to be a nurse, come to my college. I will train you how to care for the mentally ill. You will earn a paycheck, you will earn respect, you will be able to make your way in the world. He encouraged his nurses to go on to become doctors in their own right. This is before women could vote. So he was very invested in that. So the Bowen building loomed very large in the history of the Peoria State Hospital. Unfortunately, we did lose the building several summers ago. It was torn down. It was decided that it was not feasible to keep it up. So this is what is left of our glorious, beautiful, iconic Bowen building. It was interesting because when people would come to visit their relatives in the asylum on a Sunday afternoon, say, just like we're sitting around now, if your relative was bedbound, you would be taken to their room. But if your relative was ambulatory at all, if they could move around, they were brought out to see you. And so many of these family get-togethers were held on the lawn of the Bowen building. So a lot of people in the area, you talk to them, they will remember going to visit someone in the asylum and having this beautiful building rising as the backdrop to their reunion with their family member. It was really a lovely place, and it's a shame that the building had to come down.
It really is. Well, Sylvia, thank you so much for taking us around the Peoria State Hospital, showing us the rich history and the spooky history. But I heard you'd let me know that you're actually releasing a new book and that you actually are an author and you have a couple books you want to tell us about.
Yes, I have actually written 3 books about the Peoria State Hospital. There is Fractured Spirits, Hauntings at the Peoria State Hospital. That has a lot of the history and the hauntings of the place. Now, when I typed the end for that, people didn't stop having experiences. So after a couple of years, I had enough for a second book called Fractured Souls. That is also the history and hauntings of the asylum. I've also written a book called 44 Years in Darkness, which is about Rhoda Derry. Her story was so compelling that I knew she needed her own book. So those are the 3 asylum books so far. I do have a new book coming out at the end of August 2025. It's the second book in my series Gone on Vacation. It's called Gone on Vacation, Endless Summer, and it's haunted zoos, museums, amusement parks, historic villages, anywhere you'd go on vacation. And a little bit of spookiness happening there.
Great.
Bunches of fun.
Well, thanks again, and keep questioning the weird.